In October 1867, 13 men descend nearly 1,000 feet into the central shaft of a tunnel being cut through Hoosac Mountain in Massachusetts. Above them, the hoist house catches fire. The shaft floods. Nobody comes. Their bodies are recovered a year later, huddled together in a side passage where they had waited for a rescue that never arrived. The Hoosac Tunnel took 24 years to finish. Roughly 200 men died inside it, and it is far from the worst on this list. Number 13 saw an underground river swallow an entire work crew in seconds. The tunnel at number 8 buried a locomotive so deep it remains sealed underground to this day. And number 1 is a disaster so deliberately concealed that the true death toll may never be known. These tunnels were built because someone decided the mountain was in the way. The men who went inside paid the price of getting through it. Here are 15 of the deadliest railroad tunnels that buried their builders. Number 15. The Woodhead Tunnel. Beginning in 1839, roughly 1,000 men set to work cutting through the Apennine Hills between Manchester and Sheffield in England. The bore would stretch over 3 miles beneath some of the bleakest moorland in the country. Workers drilled by candlelight in shafts that flooded with every rainstorm. Ventilation was almost non-existent. Black powder blasts were a daily occurrence, and the men had no protective equipment of any kind. Injuries were constant. By the time the tunnel opened in 1845, at least 32 workers had been killed outright and well over 100 seriously injured. The company kept no official death register. A local surgeon who treated the wounded later compared the casualty figures to those of a military engagement. The Woodhead Tunnel was among the first major railroad tunnels ever built, and it established a pattern that would hold for the next century. The men who built the rails were cheaper to replace than to protect. Number 14. The Musconetcong Tunnel. The Lehigh Valley Railroad began boring through Musconetcong Mountain in New Jersey in 1872, expecting a straightforward job through shale and limestone. What the crews encountered instead was a belt of fractured rock laced with pockets of trapped water and compressed air. The tunnel flooded repeatedly. Sections that had been shored with timber collapsed without warning, burying men under tons of loose stone. The workforce consisted largely of immigrant laborers, many of them recent arrivals who had no legal protections and no realistic ability to refuse a dangerous assignment. When a cave-in killed or injured a worker, the company noted it as an incident and hired a replacement within days. The tunnel took 4 years to complete. No reliable tally of the dead was ever published, but newspaper accounts from the period describe multiple fatalities and a workforce that turned over constantly. Men did not leave because they found better work. They left because they were carried out, or because they watched someone else get carried out and decided the wages were not worth it. The Musconetcong Tunnel still carries freight traffic on what is now the Norfolk Southern System. Number 13. The Lötschberg Tunnel. On the morning of July 24, 1908, a crew of miners working the northern heading of the Lötschberg Tunnel in the Bernese Alps drilled into something they were never supposed to reach. The tunnel's route ran beneath the Canda Valley. The engineers who surveyed it believed the rock above the bore was solid. It was not. What lay directly above the heading was a buried glacial trough, an ancient channel filled with loose gravel, sand, and water that no surface survey had detected. The moment the drill bits broke through the ceiling of rock, the valley floor collapsed into the tunnel. A torrent of waterlogged debris, thousands of cubic meters of gravel and mud, roared through the heading and buried the entire work crew. 25 men were killed. Not one body was ever recovered. The debris filled hundreds of feet of completed tunnel, sealing the crew beneath a mass of saturated sediment so deep that excavation was not physically possible. The railway company faced a choice: attempt to dig through the burial and continue on the planned alignment, or abandon the heading entirely and redesign the route. They chose abandonment. Engineers rerouted the tunnel to curve around the flooded section, adding both distance and cost, but avoiding the glacial trough that had swallowed their men. The original bore was sealed permanently. It remains sealed today, an unmarked mass grave inside the mountain with no memorial and no marker at the surface. What made the Lötschberg disaster so difficult to accept was how preventable it had been. The buried trough was a known geological possibility in glaciated alpine terrain. Several engineers on the project had flagged concerns about the Canda Valley section before boring began. Those concerns were weighed against the schedule and the budget, and the schedule won. The rerouted tunnel opened in 1913 and still carries trains today. Its tracks run a few hundred meters from the passage where the 25 dead remain. Number 12. The Severn Tunnel. When the Great Western Railway decided to bore beneath the Severn estuary between England and Wales in 1873, the chief obstacle was obvious: water. The tunnel would pass under a tidal river more than 2 miles wide, and the rock beneath it was riddled with springs. In 1879, workers broke into a subterranean freshwater spring so powerful it flooded the entire works in a matter of hours. The tunnel sat underwater for months. Pumps ran around the clock, some of the largest ever constructed at the time, and men worked in conditions that alternated between suffocating heat and freezing floodwater. The project dragged on for 13 years. Workers died from drowning, from collapsing headings, and from the sheer toll of laboring in a tunnel that was actively trying to fill itself with water. The Severn Tunnel finally opened in 1886, after 13 years of construction that consumed budgets, reputations, and lives. The Great Spring was never fully sealed. Pumps still run inside the tunnel today, removing millions of gallons of water every single day, well over a century after the first crew went underground. The river never stopped trying to reclaim what was taken from it. Number 11. The Musconetcong Tunnel, also known as the Frejus Rail Tunnel. When construction began in 1857, boring through nearly 8 miles of alpine granite between France and Italy was considered by many engineers to be flatly impossible. Workers advanced using hand drills and black powder, cutting through the rock at a pace that sometimes measured in inches per day. The air inside the headings was thick with dust and powder smoke. Ventilation relied entirely on natural draft, which in a tunnel with only one open end meant that men deep inside the bore worked in an atmosphere that was barely breathable. Silicosis, though the disease had no name yet, began destroying lungs within months of steady drilling. Cave-ins, misfired charges, and rockfalls added steadily to the toll. The tunnel took 14 years to complete. The exact number of workers who died was never formally recorded by either the French or the Italian authorities. What survives are scattered parish records and local accounts suggesting the toll was substantial. The Musconetcong Tunnel proved that a railroad could be driven through the Alps. It also proved what that would cost. There is a pattern visible by this point in the list, and it has nothing to do with geology. Every one of these tunnels was built by men who had almost no say in the conditions of their labor. They were immigrants, or they were rural poor, or they were workers in countries where industrial regulation did not yet exist. The companies that hired them understood the risks involved. They budgeted for casualties the way they budgeted for timber and blasting powder, as a line item in the cost of doing business. In most cases, no official death count was maintained. The men who died underground were recorded, if they were recorded at all, in parish burial registers or in the margins of a foreman's logbook. They did not appear in annual reports. They were not named at board meetings. This was not an oversight, it was a system. The railroad needed the tunnel. The tunnel needed bodies willing to enter it, and if those bodies did not come back out, there were always more. That arithmetic held for most of the 19th century, and the tunnels that follow show how far into the 20th century it persisted. Number 10. The Moffat Tunnel. High in the Colorado Rockies, at an elevation above 9,000 feet, the Denver and Salt Lake Railway began boring through James Peak in 1923. The tunnel would run over 6 miles through some of the hardest granite in the Rocky Mountains. Conditions inside were brutal. Temperatures at the heading swung from freezing to sweltering, depending on the rock composition, and water poured through fissures at volumes that overwhelmed every drainage system the engineers could build. Silica dust hung in the air like fog. Workers drilled in shifts that ran around the clock, and many of them developed breathing problems within their first weeks on the job. Over 5 years of construction, 28 men were killed by cave-ins, equipment failures, and toxic gas exposure. Dozens more were left permanently disabled by lung disease that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The Moffat Tunnel opened in 1928 and eliminated a tortuous mountain crossing that had paralyzed winter rail traffic for decades. The men who cut it got their names on no plaque and no monument. The tunnel itself is the only proof they were ever there. Number 9. The Big Bend Tunnel. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway's tunnel through Big Bend Mountain in Summers County, West Virginia, is the tunnel that gave America the legend of John Henry. Construction began in the early 1870s, and the workforce was made up almost entirely of formerly enslaved black men and their sons. Hired at wages the railroad knew were barely enough to live on for work, the railroad knew would kill some of them. The tunnel stretched over a mile through red shale and sandstone. Workers drove steel drills into the rock face by hand, swinging sledgehammers in headings so narrow that 2 men could barely stand side by side. The air was thick with white dust from every strike. There was no ventilation system. Men breathed that dust every minute of every shift, and within months, many of them could no longer climb the grade to the tunnel mouth without stopping to catch their breath. The lung disease that was killing them had no clinical name at the time. The workers called it tunnel sickness. Modern medical understanding identifies it as silicosis, the same disease that would devastate other tunnel projects for decades to come. Estimates suggest that hundreds of men died during and shortly after construction, though the railroad's official records acknowledge far fewer. The dead were buried in unmarked graves near the tunnel's east portal, in ground that was later repurposed. The legend of John Henry, the steel-driving man who raced a steam drill and won but died with his hammer in his hand, grew directly out of this tunnel. Whether Henry was one real person or a composite of several remains debated by historians, but the core of the story is grounded in documented fact. The Chesapeake and Ohio brought a steam-powered drill to Big Bend to test whether machines could replace hand drillers. The machine proved faster. The men it replaced were not reassigned or retrained. They were simply no longer needed. What the ballad never mentions is what actually killed most of the workers at Big Bend. It was not the hammer, and it was not the machine. It was the dust. Number 8. The Church Hill Tunnel. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway built this tunnel beneath Church Hill in Richmond, Virginia, in the early 1870s. It was a short bore, less than a mile long, cut through unstable clay and loose sand. Problems began almost immediately after it opened. The tunnel leaked, shifted, and required constant shoring. By the early 20th century, trains were running through a passage that the railroad's own engineers had been flagging as structurally compromised for years. On October 2, 1925, a work crew was inside the tunnel performing maintenance when the ceiling collapsed. The cave-in buried a 10-wheel locomotive, its tender, and several flat cars under thousands of tons of earth. The engineer and fireman were killed. At least 2 laborers died with them. Rescue crews dug for days, but could not reach the locomotive. The clay kept shifting, threatening a secondary collapse that would bury the rescuers too. The railroad ordered the tunnel sealed permanently. The locomotive and the bodies of the men who could not be reached are still inside the hill. The eastern portal was bricked shut. Directly above it, the streets of Church Hill carry on over a buried train that has been underground for a century. Number 7. The Summit Tunnel. In 1866, the Central Pacific Railroad reached the granite spine of the Sierra Nevada at Donner Pass, and the only way forward was through it. The workforce was overwhelmingly Chinese, roughly 10,000 men who had been recruited from Canton Province and the California goldfields. The Summit Tunnel was the most dangerous assignment on the line. Workers were lowered in woven baskets over sheer cliff faces to hand-drill blasting holes in the granite. They packed the holes with black powder and later with nitroglycerin, then scrambled up the ropes before the fuse burned down. Not everyone made it. Inside the tunnel, the air after each blast was a choking mix of smoke, dust, and nitroglycerin fumes, and the men worked in near-total darkness. During the winters, avalanches swept through the work camps without warning, burying entire crews under walls of snow and ice. The Central Pacific kept almost no records of Chinese worker deaths. Estimates of the total toll range from several hundred to over 1,000 men killed during the construction of the Summit Tunnel and the surrounding Sierra Grade. The railroad listed none of them by name. What connects these tunnels across 3 continents and 7 decades is not the geology. It is the silence afterward. The companies that built them understood the cost in human life before the first drill bit touched rock. They accepted it, built it into the budget, and then made sure that nobody outside the project had to look at it too closely. Death counts were suppressed, rounded down, or simply never kept. Workers who died underground were buried near the portal in graves that carried no marker and no date. Their families, if they were notified at all, received no compensation, no pension, no letter, no acknowledgement that the tunnel had anything to do with the death. The tunnels themselves became the only memorials, not by design, but by default. Today, a passenger train passes through in minutes. It crosses in climate-controlled comfort, a space that took years to carve and lives to open. Nobody on that train thinks about the men who cut it. That silence was not an accident. It was engineered as carefully as the bore itself. Number 6. The Tanna Tunnel. Japan's Tanna Tunnel, bored through the Amagi Mountains on the Tokaido Main Line, took 16 years to complete. Construction began in 1918 and did not end until 1934. The mountain resisted at every stage. Workers hit volcanic hot springs that sent scalding water flooding into the headings without warning. Collapses occurred with devastating regularity. In one of the worst single incidents, a massive cave-in killed 17 workers and trapped dozens more behind walls of fallen rock. Further disasters followed throughout the decade, including flooding events that submerged the entire bore for months at a time and forced complete evacuations. The geological conditions were so unstable that engineers redesigned the tunnel's alignment multiple times during the course of construction. The recorded death toll exceeds 60 workers, though some Japanese sources place the figure considerably higher when accounting for laborers who died of injuries and illness in the months after leaving the site. The Tanna Tunnel became a symbol in Japan of both engineering perseverance and human sacrifice. It remains in service today on one of the busiest rail corridors in the world. Number 5. The Cascade Tunnel. The Great Northern Railway's original Cascade Tunnel through the Washington Cascades, completed in 1900, was built through volcanic rock in headings choked with heat and foul air. The bore ran nearly 3 miles, and ventilation during construction was dangerously inadequate. Workers suffered constant exposure to toxic gases and silica dust, and the construction toll included men who never left the heading alive. But the tunnel kept killing long after the builders left. Locomotive exhaust accumulated inside the bore to concentrations that were routinely incapacitating and occasionally fatal to train crews. Engineers reported blacking out at the controls. Then, in 1910, an avalanche at the tunnel's western approach buried 2 stranded trains at the town of Wellington, killing 96 people, in one of the worst avalanche disasters in American history. The disaster was directly tied to the operational dangers of the original tunnel's location and design. The Great Northern eventually replaced the bore with a longer electrically operated tunnel in 1929, eliminating the exhaust problem entirely. The original tunnel was abandoned. Its portals are still visible in the Cascade Wilderness, dark openings in the mountainside that lead into a passage the railroad itself declared unfit for use. Number 4. The Simplon Tunnel. When boring began in 1898 on the Simplon Tunnel between Switzerland and Italy, engineers expected difficult rock. What they did not expect was the heat. The tunnel runs nearly 12.5 miles beneath the geothermal Alps, and its route passed through zones of geothermal activity that raised the temperature of the rock face to levels that made the headings nearly uninhabitable. At the deepest points beneath the mountain, the rock registered temperatures that could burn exposed skin on contact. The air in the work zones was so hot that men collapsed from heat exhaustion within minutes of reaching the heading. The Swiss firm overseeing the project tried every countermeasure available. They pumped cold water onto the rock face continuously. They installed ventilation fans at the portal. They piped compressed air deep into the bore. None of it was sufficient. Workers stripped to the waist and labored in shifts of less than 30 minutes before staggering back toward the portal, drenched and gasping. Many of them never fully recovered. The heat was only one dimension of the problem. Underground springs burst through the bore walls at enormous pressure, flooding entire sections of the tunnel and turning the work floor into a river of hot water that could sweep a man off his feet. Rockfalls were constant. The geology shifted with almost every meter of advance. What had been stable granite in the morning could crumble into loose schist by afternoon. Over 8 years of construction, dozens of workers were killed by falls, floods, and heat collapse. Hundreds more were permanently disabled. The workforce was overwhelmingly Italian, migrant laborers from the valleys south of the Alps who had crossed the border for wages marginally better than what they could earn at home. Those who returned did so with damaged lungs and ruined joints. The Simplon Tunnel opened in 1906 as the longest railroad tunnel in the world. The engineering was celebrated across Europe. The men who made it possible were largely forgotten before the first scheduled train passed through. Number 3. The Gotthard Tunnel. The original Gotthard Rail Tunnel, bored through the Swiss Alps between 1872 and 1882, was one of the deadliest construction projects of the 19th century. The bore stretched over 9 miles through the Gotthard Massif, and the workforce peaked at roughly 4,000 men, the vast majority Italian migrants from Lombardy and Piedmont. They worked in appalling conditions. The headings were hot, poorly ventilated, and saturated with silica dust from constant mechanical drilling. Cave-ins occurred with grim regularity. Explosions from misfired charges killed and maimed workers who had no time to reach cover. In 1875, the workers staged one of the first recorded labor strikes in tunnel construction history, demanding shorter shifts and better pay. The Swiss military was called in to end it. Conditions did not improve. By the time the tunnel opened in 1882, the official death toll stood at 177 workers. Independent estimates place the true number higher, and that figure does not include the men who survived construction only to die in the following years from lung disease contracted inside the bore. The chief engineer, Louis Favre, collapsed and died of a heart attack inside the tunnel in 1879, 3 years before completion. Even the man running the project did not survive it. Number 2. The Hoosac Tunnel. The tunnel that opened this video took 24 years to build, from 1851 to 1875, making it one of the longest and most troubled construction projects in American railroad history. The Hoosac Tunnel runs nearly 5 miles through the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts, and every method of excavation available in the 19th century was tried and often failed inside it. Hand drills, steam drills, compressed air drills, black powder, and nitroglycerin all had their turn. The nitroglycerin was catastrophic. In 1867, a premature detonation killed several workers and triggered the fire and flooding that trapped 13 men in the central shaft, the disaster described at the start of this video. Their deaths were the most widely reported, but far from the last. Fires, floods, and cave-ins continued for another 8 years. The total death toll is generally placed at around 195 workers. The Hoosac Tunnel was completed at a cost that exceeded every original estimate in dollars and in lives. It remains in active service on the freight network today. A loaded train passes through in under 10 minutes. The tunnel took a generation to build and nearly 200 men to pay for. Number 1. The Great Apennine Tunnel. When the Italian government decided to bore a direct rail line through the Apennine Mountains between Bologna and Florence, engineers knew the geology would fight them every meter of the way. Construction began in 1920 on what would become the longest railway tunnel in Italy at the time, stretching over 18 kilometers through unstable rock deep beneath the mountain spine. The conditions underground were brutal from the first day of drilling. Temperatures at the working face climbed so high that men collapsed from heat exhaustion within minutes of entering the headings. Toxic gases seeped from fissures in the rock without warning. Sudden flooding drowned entire work crews in passages that had been dry hours before. Rock collapses buried men under tons of debris in headings so deep that rescue teams could not reach them in time. The workforce consisted largely of labourers from southern Italy, men who took the work because nothing else paid enough to feed a family. They drilled in shifts around the clock, year after year, through conditions that worsened the deeper the bore advanced. The project consumed 14 years. When the tunnel finally opened in 1934, it was celebrated as a triumph of Italian engineering. The newspapers praised the speed, the precision, the ambition. What they did not print was the cost measured in men. Scores of workers died during construction from collapses, flooding, gas exposure, and heat. Their names were not recorded on any monument. There is no memorial at either portal. The trains that pass through the Great Apennine Tunnel today complete the crossing in minutes, carrying passengers who will never know that the darkness around them was carved by men who did not survive to see daylight at the other end. Mountains do not care about schedules, stock prices, or the men sent inside them with a drill and a prayer. For more than a century, the railroad industry sent workers into tunnels, knowing that some percentage of them would not walk back out. The tunnels survived. The railroads survived. The men, for the most part, did not, and the mountains kept their silence.